So, Professor, when did you stop last time before we say we lost the signal? So we heard that you said the sequence, and you talk about the topic of the airlines. Then we stop there. So could we restart? No, it's okay.
What I said,
from there?
Very simply was that if you look at the stock price of the major travel industries in London, Frankfurt, New York, and China, the stocks are not going down as much as the demand has dropped during the pandemic. And what it tells you is that investors believe that the fundamentals are strong and there will be a bounce back. So the question of what innovations are needed, independent of the vaccine that's being developed, I don't think specific innovations are needed because I think that the pandemic has not altered the market fundamentals.
Yeah, and the pandemic has had an impact on global economy, and many companies also rapidly developing their online businesses. And capital is flooding into some internet and online service companies. From your perspective, will this overheat the internet industry and produce bubbles in a short time? How do you think of the floor of the capital should be restored to a healthier pattern in the next few years?
So I think that if I understand correctly, the real question you're asking me is, has the huge boom in services like Zoom, WebEx, in streaming films, for example, really the result of people being stuck at home? I do not think it'll in any way affect the technical infrastructure of the internet. There is massive capacity. And that capacity building is happening not only in terms of fiber optics, but it's also happening with, for example, Elon Musk's space-based internet access system of several thousand satellites. If you are in low Earth orbit, the latency time for a signal is just as good as a fiber optic cable on a T4 trunk line. So I don't think there are real issues in terms of technical capacity. However, I do believe that governments will begin to assess the efficacy of online learning, and corporations will begin to assess the efficacy of working remotely. And what we do have really happening is a great natural experiment. An experiment is, does online work, right? So many corporations, for the first time, like Twitter, for example, has almost all their employees working remotely. We're going to have, for the first time, really good evidence in about 2 or 3 years on the relative performance effectiveness of employees working remotely. And we're also going to have excellent data on the effectiveness of students learning remotely. And what I suspect is that online will not live up to the expectations people had before the pandemic. So there was a shift from about 2005 until 2019 in pushing online learning. I believe, looking at this from the graduate perspective, that online learning can be very effective for graduate education in certain types of programs, for certain kinds of undergraduate, but overall, there are real limitations. And the reason is simple. If you are a believer in Vygotskian learning models, we know that learning is a socialization process. So learning and working happens best when we are together and when we are face-to-face, because we can really understand each other. So I don't think there will be a bubble. I think there will be a corrective.
Oh, okay. Sure.
Can I ask a question about that? So, Professor, I understand what you just said about the environment you have been observing in the United States. But in China, after pandemic, many industries, such as many small companies, such small business, especially they did the real thing, not online, offline thing. They do a lot. But after pandemic, 90% of them went bankruptcy. I come from Wuhan, so I knew that. I know that exactly. And many small business owners they went bankruptcy.
Yeah.
So now the local governments they would invite many investors, especially they are going to set up business online because it costs relatively low and it can generate a great fortune in a certain short amount of time. But I think this kind of private investment would be faded in soon, maybe in the next 2 years. But right now, you can't imagine how crazy people invest in money for two things. The first thing is real estate.
Yeah.
Because the house will never decrease this price. And the second thing, they develop all kinds of all kinds of online entertainment, such as what you mentioned. People do not buy or shop anything offline; they just shop online. So I don't know what kind of a treat it can be called, but I feel a little worried about that. Such as some people they could not follow up with the internet trend, especially for many other Chinese like the elder generation, they cannot follow up with that. So I'm wondering, how do you perceive this kind of situation?
So
China?
You have a very
won't be a bubble.
You have two different problems here. The same push, like if you look at the stock price of Amazon and the stock price of DoorDash and other online sales platforms in the US, they have been going up since the pandemic began. But there is a very interesting and real problem, and that problem in logistics is called the last mile problem. And the last mile problem is it's a catchphrase in logistics theory, but it explains the fundamental problem you encounter, which is that whether you're a store or whether you're selling online, somebody has to physically deliver that actual package to a certain spot. And every study that has been done about this shows that what's really happening in the majority of cases is that investors are subsidizing the real cost initially of that delivery service as a way to build a user base. And so the best example I can give you is the example of Uber in the US. And you have similar car sharing services in China, similar ride sharing services. And what's happened is that for the past 10 years, the real cost of an Uber ride is not what the user pays. Investors have been investing heavily in the company and subsidizing each ride a couple cents, but they've been doing it as a way to grow the base of users. And once the base is grown, the real price will reappear. And the logic is very simple, right? Even in cities that don't have a medallion system, or like London, they don't have a system of licensing enforcement for taxi services, there is no way that the real spread between a 100-year-old taxi business and a person dropping you off in their Chevy will always be that high. It's an artificial spread. And what you see is that behind every online store, some person has to physically take that package somewhere. Something has to happen. And even if you introduce drones in like 10 years and you have drone delivery, you're still going to have that problem in terms of energy expenditure, control logistics of the last mile, and there are inefficiencies that occur in single item logistics. So I think that people want to invest because it sounds good, like it sounds great. There's a pandemic, invest online, but every online business is in fact a real business. It sells real things. Those real things have to move to real places via a real transport system. So there is a reality that you have to face.
Okay, sure. And now some technologies, just like AI, cloud computing, and you said such like Uber and Amazon, these companies are becoming more. These technologies are becoming more and more mature, and many companies can use that. But what kind of companies do you think are suitable to use these technologies to develop their business or their management? What's your idea or what's your suggestion for these companies?
Yeah, you're asking me a wonderful question because it's a question that either has no answer or it has every possible answer imaginable. If you ask IBM, like IBM is sort of one of the big leaders in the world when it comes to industrial AI. So taking artificial intelligence and using it to solve quasi-creative problems. They want you to believe that AI can solve anything, and the reality is this: AI is not the dream that we think it to be in the popular press. It just isn't. The fundamental premise of all, and this is true whether it's Tesla or IBM or it's any major company in the world running AI, right? The fundamental mechanism of AI is simply something called reinforced Hebbian learning. It's a weighted learning protocol, and that's it. So AI isn't creative. AI cannot tell you why things matter. AI is simply good at pattern recognition, and it gets better the more data sets are put in for that type of pattern. And that's all it is. So the question isn't how big is the company. The question is, does a company benefit from a specific kind of artificial intelligence process? Having said that, I do believe, and I want to be very clear about this because it's a very common misconception, that there is great promise in quantum computing and in computational hard sciences, which is very different than artificial intelligence. People tend to conflate together AI and computational computing. They are very different. Computational hard sciences are very effective at certain kinds of problem solving, AI at other kinds of problem solving. But the reality, if you ask me today, do I see AI radically altering the world? The answer is no. It's very, very good. It's very powerful pattern recognition, but that's all it is. It's not intelligence. Intelligence, if you look at classical AI theory since Minsky's lab at MIT, intelligence must be embodied and it must be locally constrained and locally defined in the context of a body in an ecosystem. And this is a very big debate actually happening right now in the AI community about the nature of the future of artificial intelligence. I don't know what that future is. I suspect that we will begin to see the emergence of AI when we have a what's called an ontologically driven embodiment, where we have physical robotic bodies that have intelligent needs, and those needs are somehow environmentally responsive, then we'll see it. In software, we won't see it.
Yeah.
But it's a very weird debate, actually. I'm sorry, go ahead, Yao.
Yeah, and I remember. Okay, and I remember. Sorry, I remember you studied ant financial, right?
Yep.
Yeah, and it's belonged to Alibaba, and
Mm-hmm.
I know the Ant Financial is going to take IPO maybe this year. Yeah, it develops very fast. So, this huge or this giant Chinese companies.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what's your idea of that. Do you think? What are your prediction on the future development of such technology financial company in China?
This is a great question. Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I think that the fundamental model. So if you look at Weibo, the platform, or Alibaba, Chinese tech companies have an ecosystem-based approach. So they try to bring users into a single platform for multiple services, which is different than the American model. And you see, it's not a critique. You simply see, strengths and weaknesses in both types of models if they are standalone business models. So in theory, nothing stops, for example, Weibo or Alibaba from attempting to replicate that kind of ecosystem approach to consumer engagement in other countries, and nothing stops the non-ecosystem or the singular service approach. For example, Twitter or Snapchat, or TikTok or Facebook are really singular service platforms. They may do many things within the platform, but Facebook isn't trying to also be your bank account, for example. Twitter isn't trying to help you organize your groceries and organize your friends, right? So this difference in approach, which is, are you an ecosystem where that social media brand becomes like an operating system, versus are you a standalone service, is going to be one of the big, I would say, differences moving forward over the next 10 years in how local tech giants develop. Having said that, I think that the future of Chinese tech companies will be closely linked to how transparent and open the market happens to be. Right? So it's an important question. It's true anywhere, right? So, we face in the U.S., for example, last week, the Department of Justice, whether you agree or not with them, they opened a case against Google, charging that Google engages in monopolistic practices by having an agreement with Apple to have the Google Chrome or Chromium browser be the default browser on iPhones. So this is a U.S. federal perspective on limitations of monopolistic practices and an attempt to control the tech giants. I suspect that in China, you have the same forces at work through different mechanisms. So you have different types of power that are attempting to use that space for their own good. And those power structures, like in the US, can be financial, they can be regional, they can be national, but they serve the interest of someone. And one of the really big questions, I think, that the world has not done a good job of, so this is not a critique of any one country, is that we have not done a good job of establishing at the level of the United Nations a new sort of compact for human digital rights. We don't have that. There is no international consensus yet on the digital citizen and what the rights of the digital citizen happen to be. And until we have those, we really don't know how protective that tech future will be. Western Europe is acting very differently than the US and very differently than China or India in the way that it treats growth of tech giants. And it seems to want to regulate privacy more heavily. I ultimately believe that technology, in most cases, is about 5 to 10 years ahead of law. So it takes lawmakers in any country about 5 to 7 years to effectively regulate what technology has already produced. And in that 7-year lag, you have an opportunity for exploitation, but also for growth and doing good. So this is a real challenge. The other thing I'm concerned about also is that as we're speaking about the nature of digital rights and digital citizenship and what that means. So I'll give you a clear example. For example, your social media set, your friends, your data, that set that you have on a certain platform, you don't own that set. You can't take it and port it somewhere else. It's not portable. You can't just import and export your own data. But you should be able to, in theory, because it's your data. It's about you, right? So there are many challenges arising. This is one of them. Another one is going to be the challenge of how we regulate genetic data. That's going to be a huge issue because just as right now, what we're really selling when we're selling social media data is we're selling people's preferences. We're monetizing minute differences in people's preferences. Soon, we will be trafficking and selling data that's genetic about people. So I'm concerned, but not concerned about any one country. So that's the truth.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, through your 10 years of consulting career, I mean, you. I can hear the echo. I don't know why.
I don't hear an echo. It's okay.
Now it's okay. I think you may use some. Can you hear me now?
Yep, I can hear you very well. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. My question is: through your 10 years of consulting career, you may use some innovation models to some companies. So, could I know what kind of your innovation model for the companies? Could you just summarize that or give the general description?
Sure. So this is, I have several very simple principles. Some of them are just best practices that I've seen in the world. Others are from my own personal experience. But my general personal interest in innovation is really focused on what I call R&D optimization. So it's how do you make research and development more effective? So I'm really looking at innovation as a process. I'm looking at R&D as a process, and I'm saying, well, where are the holes in that process? And what I've come to understand, this goes back 15 years actually, is that there are two major mistakes that large companies make when they believe they're being innovative. The first mistake is what I call the consumption trap. And the second mistake is what I call the imitation trap. So the consumption trap happens when companies believe they're being innovative because they're buying technology. So it's like, look, I buy technology, therefore I must be innovative. No, you're a consumer of technology, and that's fine, but it doesn't make you innovative. And the second trap is the imitation trap, which is, look, I'm copying technology, right? And what I have learned is that at this point in time, the nature of most real innovation, the nature of most real research is pretty weird. It's not what we think of. So we have this idea on TV and in the public, and the idea is of like the young entrepreneur, the person who starts a business and then has 100 clients, then 1,000 clients. And that's really just, in most cases, very good sales and marketing. It's not really real research and development and real innovation. What's happening today is that real R&D, number one, it happens in groups. Number two, it's happening using increasingly sophisticated computational tools and simulations. We're getting very, very good at creating literal virtual realities where we run simulations of the real world in those virtual realities. And number three, we're getting much, much, much better at understanding actually the process of search itself and the process of constructing the ideas of problems. I did a lot of work with companies, and those companies have really been at the forefront of technologies, mostly food technology and green technology.
Wow.
And what I see always is the same problem. And that problem is that they're constantly relying on either that consumption trap or the imitation trap. They want to compete with someone else who looks just like them, or they want to copy somebody else. And they're not really willing to do the deep work of asking much more fundamental, deeper questions and trying to analyze much more deeply the nature of the problems that are around them. So, you're asking a question worthy of a really, really good MBA student or a top graduate from an MBA program. And it's really a question that can consume an entire semester, if not an entire PhD program, frankly. And I could never do justice to it in 5 minutes.
Oh my God. And your answer is really good, and that's also good. And can I ask you the last question?
Sure.
Okay, the last question. I think maybe in China now.
Oops, I got logged out. 1 second. Let's restart that.